This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.
The 13th edition of the Allianz Risk Barometer has been published and it covers 92 countries, including Nigeria. This report maps the business risks that are expected globally. In Nigeria, the report highlights three key things that will determine the success or failure of businesses in Nigeria in 2024. These include changes in legislation or regulation, cyber incidents, and macroeconomic developments. We are joined this morning by Chuks Okoro, a risk and compliance expert at Allianz Insurance. Mr. Okoro, good morning, and thank you for joining us on the conversation. My first question this morning is... Right, good morning, Mr. Okoro. Can you tell us how you arrived at the figures and the rankings that you published?
Okay. So the report has been derived from a survey of over 3,000 risk professionals across 90 jurisdictions, like you said, and across our business. It gives insight or an indication to what the major risks will be going into this year. And it has been derived from a rigorous data analysis as well as data selection process. And the final results just represent, how often certain risks were selected by the respondents from that sample size. So that's how we came about the entire report, which is the 13th edition of the report.
So, Mr. Okoro, it's interesting you say that this is based on respondents. So in many ways, we can say that it's experiential information that was given. I want to look at cyber incidents, which you listed in the top 3 risks, right? Ranking within the top 3. It's interesting because we don't typically discuss cyber threats as a country. We don't see it as important. Can you quantify for us the impact of these threats?
Okay. So notably, we now have cyber incident risk as the most important risk globally for the third year in succession. So that has happened from previous editions. We believe that this is due to rapid adoption of groundbreaking technological advancements, right? So in areas like generative AI, in areas like fintech, payments, also health tech, and others, right? We believe that this massive adoption of technology, combined with the technical intricacies to actually utilize this technology, as well as the lack of regulatory framework, strong regulatory framework, would lead to high occurrence of the perils that are associated with this particular risk, which include IT outages, malware attacks, ransomware attacks, and so what we suggest or what we believe the government can do is believe that the supervisory authorities from the country will be very important for this year. So we have NISTA, we have NDPC. We believe that they have to ensure that there is strong regulation framework in place, especially the ethical usage of these technologies and to protect the end users, right? We also believe that businesses should take informed decisions on how to really protect their assets as well as their data. There are a lot of options businesses can leverage, including insurance, right? So they should take as much as possible to manage the risk.
Well, Mr. Okoro, it's not just all doom and gloom in this particular report, but based on the risks that we see an upward trend throughout the year, which one would you say we have the capacity to curtail if the government is willing?
Okay, so that would be for number 5, climate change, right? So we're quite happy that there have been high-level discussions on the topic, right? You see that at various forums like COP27, COP28. You don't see that at forums like the World Economic Forum. But we need more. We also need more commitment at the highest levels of government to ensure that we are moving towards net zero carbon emission. And there are a couple of things government can do, but one of the main they can do in the short term is to, focus on what more developed economies have done, so they can look towards like Europe, and not necessarily to mirror what they have done, but just to take aspects of what they have done.
So Just before we wrap up, there are three risks that you identify as taking a downward trend. That's the positive, right? And I'll just quickly outline them: political risks and violence, energy crisis, and business interruption. You're projecting that we will see a downward trend this year. And based on this, do you think that what are the sort of gains that we could possibly make on these downward trends? Or do you think that the impact of the other ones, the ones that we will see a rise in, the legislation issues, cyber incidents, will they nullify any possible gains we could get?
So typically, from previous editions of the report, we don't expect various risks to nullify other risks. And this gives an indication to what country managers as well as business managers can look forward to within the year and prepare adequately for, right? In this particular report, we already mentioned the top series, and I think that's where a lot of businesses, and also country managers need to really put a lot of focus on. For changes in legislation and regulation, we believe that, for instance, government will play a big role in that. We believe the current government needs to put in place strong fiscal policies. So there's a lot of confidence in the economy, and it can be stronger. We also believe that the supervisory authorities need to play a big role in the sense that they need to ensure that there's enough regulation that guarantees healthy competition and also an expansion of the various sectors. That also ties a lot to what we do when it comes to our macroeconomic performance, right? Because it will really attract a lot of shareholders and capital into various sectors, right? So the macroeconomic side, we already know that, for instance, we saw the reports from the NBS some days ago, the Consumer Price Index and inflation report. We see that inflation has increased by 0.72%, so it's about 30% now. There's also double-digit unemployment rate. There's high underemployment rate. We have supply and demand linked issues with foreign exchange. So on that front, we have a lot of issues as well that government needs to tackle head on. There needs to be prudent spending. There needs to be targeted spending towards key levers of production and things like healthcare, education, right? So we already spoke about cyber risk, right? So we believe that these are the key ones that country managers need to really take note of, and as much as possible put in place enough mitigants to manage the situation and ensure you maximize profitability as well as maximize productivity on a subnational level.
Well, our guest this morning is Chuks Okoro, a risk and compliance, Chuks Okoro is a risk and compliance expert at Allianz Insurance. And he joined us to speak on the 13th edition of the Allianz Risk Barometer, which was published and identifies business risks expected in 92 countries, including Nigeria, in 2024. The rest of this conversation is happening in just a moment. Do stay with us.
This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.
The Minority Caucus in the House of Representatives has demanded sanction of appeal court judges whose rulings saw the sacking of 16 lawmakers of the People's Democratic Party. Now, the bone of contention, as identified by the minority leader Chinda Kingsley, who is from the PDP in Rivers, rests on the fact that the 16 lawmakers were sacked on the basis of pre-election matters, in contrast to the ruling of the Supreme Court, which dismissed pre-election matters in affirming the victory of Governor Caleb Mutfwang of Plateau State. Now, further compounding this situation is the fact that the sacked lawmakers cannot appeal the judgment of the appeal court at the Supreme Court. Our guest this morning on the conversation is Mani Ikpebe, a legal practitioner. Mr. Ikpebe, good morning and thank you for joining us on the conversation.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. Ikpebe, what is your reaction to this position that has been taken by the minority leader of the House of Representatives, Mr. Chinda Kingsley, regarding sanctions for the appeal court judges?
Well, it's very sad that the Court of Appeal will act in this manner. Because as it is, the Court of Appeal is actually, as a lot of legal practitioners will say, the weakest link in the line of judicial pronouncement, because the Supreme Court affirmed that it is not, the pre-election matter is not what to bring into electoral issues. And the Court of Appeal has gone on to rule on pre-electoral matters and have succeeded in truncating the mandate and the will of the people of Plateau State, which the Supreme Court affirmed in the governorship election. So Mr. Chinda is right to actually call for sanctions on the judges or justices of the Court of Appeal.
Mr. Ikpebe, I wonder if we should have seen this call from earlier, before the Supreme Court did a final judgment regarding the Plateau governorship situation. And here's why. We saw the same issue creep up during the presidential election petition, and the court essentially ruled in much the same way, where there were challenges to the candidacy of both the president and the vice president as running mates for the All Progressives Congress. This came up before. It was already established precedents. Should we have had this call from earlier?
You see, it's what the precedent is that you follow it. So I don't know how the Court of Appeal would deviate from a precedent that has been laid down already. Pre-election matters should not be brought into electoral issues. It's simple. So it's sad, and it's very, very sad one for the judiciary.
Things like this have driven a few to call for legislative seats, contests to legislative seats to be taken, to be allowed to reach the Supreme Court. Do you support this argument? Do you think that we'll actually see any widespread support rallying behind it?
Yes, I do. Absolutely. I do support the fact that the Constitution should be amended, and just like the governorship elections and the presidential elections, legislative elections should be allowed to go to the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is the final court, and so it will rule eventually. Now look at what has happened in Plateau State. The Supreme Court has finally laid down the precedent, has stated that these people, you cannot rule on the basis of the pre-election matter. Now the legislative elections in Plateau State cannot go further. They cannot be reviewed. Nothing can be done. So the mandate of the senators, the legislators, and the state House of Assembly members have been stolen by the Court of Appeal. And right now, there's no remedy for them. All they have to do now is to sit down and wait and hope that they contest again in another 4 years and win. So it's very sad. I support the call for a review of the law to make sure that this goes up to the Supreme Court, no matter what it is, for them to actually get justice, because Supreme Court is final.
Mr. Ikpebe, thank you very much for speaking with us this morning. Our guest, Mani Ikpebe, a legal practitioner, was speaking on the calls from the Minority Caucus of the House of Representatives calling for sanctions to be applied on appeal court judges whose ruling sacked some 16 lawmakers of the People's Democratic Party from Plateau State and in the Plateau State House of Assembly.
This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.
Very good morning to you. You are listening to Now Breakfast on Radio Now 95.3 FM Lagos. My name is Stephen Imediegu. It's time for the interview, and this morning's conversation is one that is pertinent at this time. It's a very important conversation, and we will be having it with the man at the center of the conversation. We ask, as always, that you pay attention. If you want to take notes as well, please do, because the information that will be revealed during the course of this conversation will be beneficial to you. The World Health Organization says that 680,000 people died from malaria in the year 2022. Now, these numbers are staggering, but what they present is the reality of many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The situation is worsened by the fact that West Africa has acquired a reputation as the hotbed for the sale of counterfeit medicines. And while the Nigerian Food, Drug and Administration and Control Agency, NAFDAC, has tried to fight the menace with the use of technology, the production and sale of counterfeit medication has not stopped. Our guest on the interview this morning is Dr. Feyi Ogunade, the coordinator of the West Africa Organized Crime Observatory, ENACT, from the Institute of Security Studies. Dr. Ogunade, good morning, and thank you for joining us on the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Right. Dr. Ogwande, if you could talk to us, because we read the reports that you put forward regarding this conversation, especially as it relates to counterfeit medication. How serious a problem are we looking at when we talk about counterfeit malaria medication in West Africa?
Well, I mean, it is quite serious. Generally speaking, we are told, well, the United Nations tells us that malaria around the world, malaria causes morbidity and mortality, particularly in Africa, infecting 234 million people. And in 2021, we are told that's a huge figure. In 2021, killing over 500 million people, the whole of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. But recently, even the WHO says 500,000 people, well, the UN estimates that trafficked malaria products kill about 500,000 sub-Saharan Africans every single year. So it's a huge problem. I mean, where you can imagine if you put, I don't know, maybe 1,000 people in a jumbo jet and suddenly that jumbo jet crashes. I mean, there will be hues and cry. But now we are talking about probably 500,000 people in sub-Saharan Africa dying from malaria products or fake malaria product. It's a massive problem. I mean, personally in my house here, my son was ill a few months ago, and we took him to the hospital. The drugs was not working. The doctor himself said to us, I think this malaria is fake. It's a problem. It affects all of us.
So, doctor, can you explain to us, set for us, what exactly has allowed fake drugs to proliferate in this way? Why is it this critical of a problem?
Recording in progress.
It's a very good question. Well, the challenge we have is that many countries, I mean, we all know where we live, we're all West Africans. The challenge we have is that many of these drugs are typically produced in illicit laboratories, often located in countries with weak regulatory systems. My personal view is that our systems are just weak. And with limited public awareness, high drug prices, particularly, for example, in Guinea, the drug prices in Conakry, Guinea are so high that people turn to street drugs. So when people turn to street drugs, what normally happens, you have an entry by criminal gangs to produce rubbish and give it to people. But again, it filters down to the weak regulatory systems that we have and poorly regulated supply chains. So you have pharmacies in some of our backyards, and they buy the open market. And so what normally happens is that you leave a space for fake drugs to come in. And again, they are bribes, they are kickbacks. I don't know whether you saw the recent report. I think from the NAFDAC lady, the lady. I want to.
That's the NAFDAC DG Mojisola Adeyeye.
I think so, and from Abia, where they were raiding some of these factories producing all sorts of problems. But that is the problem we have in West Africa. It's not only Nigeria, all across West Africa. And you must recognize that particularly where we have irredentism within the Sahel, it's a good spot to produce all type of rubbish for people, whether it's fake drugs, whether it's fake drinks. Yeah, if a criminal wants to set up something, the best place to set it up is somewhere in the Sahel, where there are no systems, it's out of reach of government. So it's a massive, massive problem. And then when some of these people are caught, there are kickbacks, there are bribes, they don't get to court. So the whole system across West Africa is quite weak. And I don't want to pinpoint a particular country, but right across West Africa, there's a massive problem. And the reason for the article is, as I said, it stemmed out of the fact that my son was ill, and I went to the hospital, took him to the hospital, and unfortunately, for over a week, the drugs that we are giving him, apparently the doctor says, I think these drugs are fake. So I said, okay, I think it's now time for me to write an article on fake drugs. So that is the problem. So limited enforcement capacity, corrupt bureaucrats and government inspectors, kickbacks, bribes, weak regulatory system are all part of the problem where we have this type of problem.
Right, Dr. Ogwande, there's also in this report that you wrote the efforts by NAFDAC to combat fake drugs as far as this conversation is concerned. The use of the barcode to scan the medication at every single interaction, it has been relatively popular in Nigeria. Is this something that other governments in the sub-Saharan region are looking to emulate to fight the proliferation of counterfeit medication?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I used to live in the Gambia and in Senegal. I was told that there was a delegation that came from those countries to Nigeria to observe a few years ago, to observe how we are doing it in Nigeria. So it's a text-based system where we're using a code concealed. When you buy most of these drugs, there's a code concealed under the scratch panel. And then you can actually call a number to verify the authenticity of that particular medicine. So it's a very good system. Unfortunately, it's a system that only works properly when if people can read and write and they're informed that this procedure, they're informed that this procedure is in place. Many times when I buy drugs and we ask friends, do you know what this is? They have absolutely no idea what that is. But at least for people who are aware, I think it's a very good system because it acts as a primary gatekeeper of drug quality. Because when you scratch the panel, and then if you're in doubt, and then you can call a number, and then that number will tell you whether there's somebody at the end of the voice that will tell you whether this drug is fake or not. So, and I know that a few years ago, some people came to Nigeria to understand what the Nigerian government is doing or NAFDAC is doing. So it's an absolutely brilliant way to monitor and trace where these medicines are coming from.
So I want to take you back a moment, Doctor. In your report, you do talk about Burkina Faso and Guinea being centers, particularly notorious for these fake drugs, fake anti-malarial drugs, right? I wonder if your research has shown that they are centers of production or are they centers of transit, points of transit for these drugs? Because if we're talking about the West Africa region, then there are questions on whether it is that the other member states are mostly importing from these two countries that were highlighted.
Okay, another brilliant question. Right across West Africa, there are illicit laboratories everywhere. I mean, we have them in Nigeria. But the United Nations highlighted Guinea and Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso, for the reasons I've just given, there's so much irredentism in that area. It's part of the Sahel. And so, but those areas mainly are transit corridors. These drugs come from somewhere in Asia, India, and China, where there are illicit laboratories, and they pass through those places. But in Guinea particularly, the cost of drugs are quite high. So what normally happens is that it's an entry point for people to bring in fake drugs, sell drugs on the street, on the open markets. So mainly as a transit point. But Burkina Faso, research tells me, particularly Burkina Faso, is actually a point where you have illicit laboratories, small laboratories, mobile labs, and people produce all type of rubbish to give their fellow West Africans.
Right.
So it's both a transit point and a production point.
Doctor, your report also talks about the efforts that African governments are making to fight back, collaborations between nations. It mentions Nigeria and Cameroon coming together. You also talk about, I believe, the Lome initiative as well. You've just mentioned areas in sub-Saharan Africa where it appears that there is weak regulation. Is there anything that can be done at this time to strengthen the regulations in these areas, perhaps to as well encourage these governments to see the need to fight this menace at their borders?
Yes. Again, another good question. But you spoke about the Lome initiative. I actually never knew what that Lome initiative was. As a matter of fact, before my life with the ISS, I used to work as one of the senior lawyers of the African Union. I worked for them for many, many years. And so I never knew about the Lome initiative until I was doing this research. Well, it's a binding agreement to criminalize the trafficking and falsification of standard drugs in Africa. And it's quite useful. But unfortunately, only 7 countries have signed up to it. So in other words, if you have this type of arrangement, and then more countries buy into the agreement, then we are all looking out for each other. But for right now, the only 7 countries, as far as I know, the only 7 countries that are part of the agreement. You are quite right. Recently, Nigeria and Cameroon also signed a cooperation agreement to fight fake drugs and then across the border. Because don't forget, many of those drugs actually come across the border. Even though Nigeria will produce stuff here, but they are produced right across West Africa. So there is no one singular country that is the source and the factory for all of these things. Every single country in West Africa is involved. And that is the reason why I suspect the Nigerian government and the Cameroonian government decided to collaborate to fight this thing, because they realize that both countries are affected. But again, going back to your question, I think in terms of collaboration, information dissemination is quite important. Unfortunately, the vast majority of our people in West Africa can't read and write. I mean, if you go to, for example, in Niger Republic, in Guinea-Bissau, or in Burkina Faso, you will be amazed. Vast majority of people simply can't read and write. The information network in those places are so poor. People have no idea what is happening around. And so it is quite easy for criminals to infiltrate the market and serve this type of fake drugs to people, unsuspecting people who can easily kill them. But my view is, when I remove my legal hat, I'm a journalist as well. I've been a journalist for many, many, many years. Yeah. And so I think information dissemination is quite important. And if we as West Africans are to succeed in countering the menace of these fake drugs, our government must match up information dissemination. And it starts with the school. You see, as journalists, we write reports, we do radio programs and TV programs, but we forget an important plank of information dissemination, which is the school. Why, for example, don't we teach fake things in school, right from primary school, so that children can identify? I've always given the example of Coca-Cola or Pepsi. The reason why some of those brands are important is that right from birth, I mean, Coca-Cola, for example, is just sugar, water, and coloring. It's rubbish drink. But what they've done is that they will never allow you to forget that there's a brand called Coca-Cola or Pepsi out there. And right from birth, they intend to infect and to make people drink their products. So I say to myself, we can flip the conversation or the discourse over and say, when we have all of the issues, why don't we start teaching them in school? So that these children grow up knowing that these things are wrong. A, we should not establish illicit factories, and B, we know how to identify them. So information dissemination, in my view, is quite important. All of these other measures are important, but they are cosmetic. They are ad hoc, and they don't actually get to the meat of the problem.
So,
and of course, we are talking about. Okay, go ahead.
I mean, I must ask, I want to make a reference to a report that you also referenced, which is the ECOWAS report on bad pharma that tracks illicit drugs and how it spreads across the sub-region, right? And in this report, the ECOWAS team points out India and China as being countries outside of the continent that are sources of creation. In the West Africa region, it also identifies Nigeria as being a critical point, whether it's through the importation of these fake drugs or even just the creation of these fake drugs, right? So there's a proliferation that's on a massive scale. I'm curious, this method that you are advocating, is it really the most effective way to go? That every time you go to the pharmacy to buy a drug, you have to always check, as opposed to the authorities having put a tight enough system that makes sure that, you hardly have to check whatsoever. And I want to use this to perhaps compare with the Arms Trade Treaty, which has a similar method where countries that, for instance, manufacture weapons are supposed to have some sort of tag, a way to track the weapons that are manufactured in their territory and where it goes to, so that if it ends up elsewhere, they can easily identify it very clearly. So I wonder if these aren't some of the things we should look at. More engagement with China and India, more engagement from our own regulatory authorities, as opposed to this other way.
You're absolutely right. Now, you see, what I'm saying to you is that it's a complex. There is no one singular method that will eradicate illegality or criminality across the world, or particularly in Africa. Now, if you leave West Africa, for example, and go to the United Kingdom, you go to a pharmacy, you are not even thinking whether this drug is fake or not. You're not thinking about it. Why is that the case? They have established system. I mean, even though there are criminals bringing drugs into Europe, but believe me, you need to have a PhD in drug trafficking. They monitor every single thing on the way. And when you are caught, the consequences are quite high. When in West Africa, I mean, you're absolutely right. We should engage China and India and all those other countries in Asia. The problem is they know that our borders are so porous. They know that some of our officials are corrupt. They know that you can bring things into the country or into the continent with very little consequences. Take, for example, Rwanda. Why is it not the case that some of the things happening in many West African countries don't happen in Rwanda? Because they have instituted systems. It's a broad brush. I mean, we are not suggesting that Rwanda is perfect, absolutely not. But believe me, by the time you want to do some of these things in that country, you think twice. Because whatever you do, the consequences are so high. But in most places in West Africa, for example, you import rubbish into the continent. What happens? You can bribe your way and get kicked. You can bribe your way out of the system. So yes, we need engagement with China. We need engagement with Asia. I completely agree with you. There's no singular answer. So when those systems don't work, that is why I'm saying to ourselves that we need to organize ourselves in such a way that we, the citizens, can identify. But because very clearly, the systems are not working across West Africa. But I'm saying to us, we must identify where this problem is, and we know them. But information dissemination is also very, very important in my view. But yes, you are right. We need to engage with Asia. We need to engage with all where these people are coming from. But the truth of the matter is, some of these drugs don't come from China. Us. Yeah, they come from us. So what do? We make sure that our internal processes are okay, so we clamp down on this illegality, put people in prison, and make sure that they don't happen again. But unfortunately, right across West Africa, that's what has happened. And when you look at the Sahel is in flames. How do you regulate things coming out of the Sahel? All along the porous borders. Mali, Niger, these are massive countries. Burkina Faso, massive countries just like Nigeria, where people are just sitting down there doing illegal things and then supplying the whole of the West African sub-region. It's a problem. So I'm saying to ourselves that, okay, if we cannot do all of those things, if our governments are weak, if our regulatory systems are weak, what else can the citizens do? And that's why I applaud what NAFDAC is doing, that the trace and track system, at least for people like myself and yourself who are educated enough, who can read properly, we can look at the drug and call somewhere and somebody can tell us, no, don't take that drug, it's fake.
Dr. Ogunade, thank you very much for speaking with us this morning, and thank you for the work that you're doing to combat illicit drugs in the sub-region.
My pleasure, and thanks to your colleague as well.
Our guest this morning is Dr. Feyi Ogunade, the West Africa Organized Crime Observatory Coordinator for ENACT, out of the Institute for Security Studies, speaking to us this morning on the fight to stop counterfeit medication from flowing through Africa and, if you like, the entire world.
And just as we wrap up, it is important to say that since the economic turn, talking about May 29th and some of the big policies that the current administration took, we know that the cost of drugs have been on the rise. We've seen a few pharmaceutical companies in the country change their mode of operation. And as such, there is a high concern of the risk of fake drugs, not just anti-malarial drugs, fake drugs in the Nigerian market. We ask that you be more vigilant. And of course, the work ahead of the authorities is on the rise. And we hope that they will be able to match up to what is needed. And that's the interview this morning here on Now Breakfast. In just a bit, Community Watch comes your way.
This is Now Breakfast.
This is Radio Now 95.3 FM.